Welcome everyone to this week's video lecture for History 2315 or World History 1. So this topic for this week is evolution and the spread of Homo sapiens and some other hominins out of Africa. So this is probably the most controversial subject we deal with in World History 1. In as much as most of you know, evolution is not a 100% across the board accepted theory. This is the scientific theory that we in academia are relying on in order to build out human prehistory and what was happening in terms of the sort of development of this branch of living creatures called hominins towards this creation of modern anatomical human beings. As we all know, there are other viewpoints out there for the age of the Earth. There's other viewpoints out there for the origins of humanity. In fact, your textbook actually gives you a number of varying creation narratives from different parts around the globe as primary sources. And so you can see that this is not the only way to explain the development of human beings. In fact, for the majority of human history, there have been other explanations as to how human beings came to be. But what we're concerned with here is this sort of narrative history of evolution. And I'm not asking that anybody who may not believe in the theory coming into this lecture to have their minds changed or to shift their views on the subject. All I'm asking is that you gain some familiarity with the narrative. Believing in something and understanding something are two totally different processes. In fact, there are many biblical scholars out there who study deep corners of church history and biblical history that are not Christians. And so it's not having a knowledge of these things doesn't necessarily equate to having to believe in them. And so for the purposes of our course, this is the history that's being provided by our textbook. The people in those textbooks who are sort of contributing to it and providing the evidence, they are experts. As a historian, I am not. The evidence that we're building upon today is archaeological. It's mitochondrial DNA spread. It's genome mapping. These are things that are way over my head as a historian. And so what I've done is essentially sort of condensed and presented the textbook's version of evolution to you all. So without further ado, we're going to dive right into this video lecture. And I do want to remind you all that this video lecture is not for, minute detail. I'm not going to go through everything that I went through in the PowerPoint or everything that's talked about in the textbook. I'm just trying to hit the high points to kind of give you the information that you're going to need to really synthesize. The textbook and my PowerPoints will give you the bullet point facts about, or bullet point information that you need to apply to the bolded terms. And you'll see as you go throughout the PowerPoint, there are these terms that have been bolded out. Those are the key terms that are most likely to show up on an exam. And this is also the most technical lecture that I'm going to go through this semester. So don't be surprised or even annoyed if I'm stumbling over some of these Latin names that have been given to other hominins. Because again, this is not my particular field of history. I deal with a much later date and with human documentary evidence. So, with all that being said, I'm just going to give you the broad developments and hope that you're pulling the sort of information, the detailed evidence you need out of the lectures. And if you have any questions, you're always free to contact me. So, to give you the big, broad overview of this, we're starting about 6 million years ago when the first hominins started to diverge from a family of primates known as the great apes. That generally includes gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans. I think bonobos recently have been added into that particular collective. But it also includes modern human beings and everything that came between the great apes and modern human beings, a group we're going to collectively refer to as hominins. So the first fossil evidence we have of this divergence away from the great apes is a fossil known as Orrorin tugenensis. So this particular fossil is dated back to about 6.1 to 5.7 million years ago. It was found in the Tugen Hills in Kenya right around 2000 Common Era. So this particular fossil showed some ability to be able to stand up on his two hind legs. Definitely not for long periods of time, but they could perform locomotion on two legs. In other words, these are bipedal animals. These are the first animals that we're seeing as opposed to great apes who prefer to walk. They can stand, but they can't really walk on their back. Chimps can kind of, so can gorillas. They kind of wobble and then they fall. Most of the time, those other great apes are going to be walking around on all fours. This particular fossil shows evidence that it was able to stand up and walk for long periods of time, and that's why it's important to the development here. Now, Tugenensis is kind of a dead branch of the hominid family. It's really the Australopithecines that are important to the development of humanity. The Australopithecines, there's two sub-branches of it, and there's two really important fossil remains that are identified with each. The first group that was discovered was, well, not discovered, the first group that sort of emerged was Australopithecus afarensis. This is named after the Afar region of Ethiopia in the Awash River Basin. Here, a couple of scientists are able to find fossil evidence from an hominin that they call Lucy, after the Beatles song, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. But it's supposed to have lived between 3.4 and 2.9 million years ago. The other subgroup of the Australopithecines is Australopithecus africanus. And this particular group is said to have lived between 2.8 to 3.3 million years ago. And they're very interesting because they kind of look like a cross between modern humans and the great apes. And this is really sort of, it's the best fossil evidence we have here is the Tong child that was found just outside of Johannesburg in South Africa in 1924. So this particular species is important, and they think it's more important than afarensis because they believe that this looks like the branch of humanity from which the modern Homo sapiens are going to emerge. A lot of people started to think that this was the missing link. There was a great deal of argument about what these fossils really represented in the overall sort of human family. But those are there's something going on here where we're seeing that all these, you got Kenya, one is found, South Africa's another is found, Ethiopia. They're all from the same region of Africa. And these are the types of things that I really want you to kind of boil down and get through to. This begs a really big question. Why are all these hominins that start to branch off and become the human family, why are they emerging in this particular area of Africa? And if we're to believe the theory of evolution, then we also need to believe in a process known as natural selection. Simply put, natural selection is this process by which the species that are best suited to adapt to changes in their environment would be favored by evolution and survive, whereas species that fail to adapt are going to die out. And so what we're seeing here is that in East Africa, there's a lot of changes going on while the hominins are arising and adapting in these time periods. Namely, East Africa is undergoing a process known as desertification. This means that what was once a lot of heavily forested land is starting to turn into Saharan or Sahelian land, or what they call savannas. And so there's fewer trees and they become grasslands. And this is the environment, as this process is playing out in terms of the overall global climate, that's why these species are developing while this process is going on. They're being forced to adapt to desertification. They're being forced to adapt to these new grasslands that are starting to emerge in East Africa. And so these are the ones that are best able to adapt to it, and that is why we see their legacy continuing on. So essentially, as these grassy lands start to emerge with little to no tree cover, this is going to drive the hominin family to say, enough with the trees. They leave the trees, and they come down to the grasslands, and they live there, they hunt there, they gather there, and they have to defend themselves there. Standing upright and walking around on 2 feet has incredible advantages when you're talking about living in a grassland. Number one, if you've got to be walking over these like wide areas of grassland, it helps to have your hands free. I can carry stuff with me. If I kill an animal, I can throw it over my shoulder and walk and go. And I can move from one point to another. Another thing that's really important here is that because we're standing on 2 feet, we're gaining greater dexterity. All these hominids are starting to show better amounts of dexterity with their hands. And this is where we start to see the development of opposable thumbs. This gives hominids the ability to grasp things. And it also gives us fine motor skill. I can hold something fully in one hand while moving around with my opposable thumb on the other. And so this is what makes the hominid branch of primates really keen tool users, something that we're going to talk about a little bit down the line. This is what allows them to manipulate the natural world around them to their own ends and their own needs. There's another major factor going on here, and it's self-defense and self-preservation. The fact of the matter is, hominids at this point in time are not on the top of the food chain. They are being preyed upon by other animals. Namely, the largest predator that would be hunting down humans would be big cats in the grasslands. And as we all see, if you've ever watched a Discovery Channel documentary on lions, even watch your house cat. What do they do when they're about to attack something? They get down real low to the ground and they sit still. House cats will wiggle their butt around. I don't know where that comes from. But I think I've seen big cats doing that too. I'm diverging, just like evolution. Now, the thing is, these cats are going to pounce down. They're going to hide in the grass, and they're going to wait for some schmuck to walk by, and then they're going to ambush that person. And so it helps to be able to stand up, and instead of getting down on all fours and trudging through the grass like a gorilla or a chimpanzee would, we stood up and we looked. And we have 3D optical vision that allows us to look over the grassland. Yeah, I see something crouched in the grass down there. Everybody be careful. There's something over there. It's a cat. And it's for defense. To be able to stand up and see out over the grassland is a huge benefit. And it's a huge adaptation for human beings that allowed them to be successful in this environment and survive. So, another major factor that is going to allow human beings, and this is something I really want to drive at here. Human beings and other hominids, we are group creatures. We live in group dynamics. If you think we developed cognitive and social abilities as a result of having to live in groups. And so when these primates came down from the tree, when we have primates all live in social organizations, but when the hominids come down from the trees, they have to be able to communicate better than a gorilla group or another group of animals would, because we rely on safety in numbers. That we are, as a species, physically inferior to most of the animals around us. Think about this. A human and a gorilla, who's going to win unarmed in a one-on-one fight? A gorilla is going to rip you limb from limb. They're huge. They are way bigger, way more powerfully muscled than a human being could. Even though you look at chimps, they're smaller than a human being. They're like 3.5, 4 feet tall. They're denser in terms of their musculature. They're stronger than a human being can ever be. They're more nimble and agile. They're also more powerful and fearsome. They have sharp fangs. They are very, very strong. They are physically better off than human beings in a natural environment. A lion has razor sharp teeth. It's got sharp claws. Hippos are huge. They're going to crush anything that they encounter. And their jaws actually, they got those tusks in there. They come together like razor blades. Hippos are very ill-tempered, some of the most dangerous animals that you'll find in Africa, even up to this day. The jaws of a hyena can snap through bone. Even cheetahs can run 70 miles an hour. All of these things, we lack this as a group. We don't have it. I can't claw anybody with this. I can't bite through any bone. I don't run 70 miles an hour. So I rely on my group to keep me safe. And that requires communication, and it requires cognitive ability. Because it's not good enough for me to sit up and go, there's a cat over there. It's probably going to kill somebody. I have to be able to stand up, look at the cat over there, and then turn around and go, hey, guys, there's danger. There's a cat right there. He's going to kill someone. I have to be able to speak. I have to be able to communicate the danger that I see to my group members. We protect each other by safeties and numbers. And so one lion is always going to kill a human being without a gun or some other form of weapon. And so we rely on these kinds of things to keep us alive. We need these group dynamics in hominids. So we are very, very social creatures, and we rely on social cohesion and cooperation. And that is something that other animal groups have not really mastered the same way that the hominins and later human beings would. Finally, we require a larger, more complex brain because of our group dynamics. For us to be able to interact with a wide number of organisms and know how to interact with them, for example, you talk differently with your friends than you do with your professors, than you do with your parents. You carry three different social identities. In your brain, this is hard to keep track of. You need to have a pretty well developed. A cat doesn't have this ability to go, well, to that person, yeah, I try to position myself as like a rock star, and then this guy over here, I'm a meek nerd. I play my. They don't think like that. They are what they are. Human beings differ. They change their social interactions based on who it is they're interacting with. And the homonyms are good examples of a move in this direction, to where our brains are always getting bigger as this development comes towards Homo sapiens. The brains are getting bigger because they're being forced to process more complex information and social relationships. So it's kind of a chicken and the egg thing going on there. To where you could argue, group dynamics forced us to get smarter, and our ability to get smarter made our group dynamics more intricate and complex. And so this is sort of a twofold operation as evolution is moving forward, and natural selection is taking place in this area of East Africa. So moving down through the rest of some of the hominids that I introduced to you all in the lecture, the next one that I talked about was Homo habilis. Habilis is a proto-human that dates to between 2.3 and 1.6 million years ago. This guy is kind of important because he walks upright at all times, never dropping back down on all fours. Now, unlike the other hominids we talked about in the last few slides, this one is going to have a much larger brain and a much larger brain, a more complex brain structure. And we're seeing evidence of this from the fossils that are pulled out of Olduvai Gorge in East Africa, Tanzania. It was found in the 1950s by Mary and Louis Leakey. They're both very notable anthropologists and archaeologists. They unearthed the fossil remains of what they call deer boy. This is a 1.8 million year old young Homo habilis whose burial place was surrounded by stone tools that were used for butchering and hunting large game. This is a big step forward. They call Homo habilis the skillful man because he's skillful at making and using tools, in particular stone tools. Now, this shows us a major leap forward in cognitive ability. This shows what we call symbolic or abstract thinking. So right here I have a piece of paper. There's my paper. If I give this to something without cognitive ability to think abstractly, without the ability to think symbolically, they go, that's what it is. But to me, it can become a paper airplane or something of that nature. I'm not actually going to go through it because I suck at making paper airplanes. But that's the idea. I can turn this paper here like that. I should have done that in the first place. It's a ball. I can throw it. There you go. That is tool making. To see a piece of paper and go, it doesn't have to be a piece of paper. I can use it for something else. To see a piece of stone and go, that doesn't just have to be stone. I can use that for something else. That requires a more complex brain. It requires an organism that can look at something and not just see what's there, but what could be there, possibility and potential. And so the creation of tools, until very recently, the usage and creation of any tools has been what separated humanity from the animal kingdom. But then we started to find out more about animals. We're seeing that animals actually do use tools. The most notable example of this is chimps in Africa will take they find a specific type of twig and they bend it to be like a fishing pole that they can stick in termite holes. Then they'll pull it out, they eat all the termites off of it, and they get a nice little snack. Now that's tool use. That is certainly them being very, very close in terms of evolution. To humans, it's not shocking that they'd be able to manipulate a stick into something. But stone tool use is a different beast together. That's where I have to take a piece of rock, a pretty hard and rigid substance, and I got to actually carry out an exact task to turn it into something else. It's a lot different from just bending a stick. But that's the important thing you need to take away from Homo habilis, is that he is really the most adept tool user that we're going to see develop of all the proto-humans that we're looking at. And if you're going through the slideshow at this, I've given you some funny images of what Homo habilis might have looked like. Again, all the images that I'm putting on there are artists' reconstructions based on our best information of their skeletal and facial structures. But these are all best guess kind of what these animals or hominids would have looked like. So moving forward, that brings us to an hominid that most of you are probably familiar with the name, Homo erectus, or the upright man. Between 2.5 and 1 million years ago, many of the different hominid groups are living side by side in East Africa. But there's archaeological evidence for a really big die-off of a lot of the hominid groups by about 1 million years ago. And so there's one group that's going to kind of fill the void of all those others, and that is Homo erectus. Right between, they're going to live between 1.8 and 200,000 years ago. This species is more fully bipedal and upright than all the other ancestors we've been talking about. He also has mastered the use of stone tools. But this group is going to do something new, something that Homo habilis didn't really achieve. They are going to harness the power of fire, which is a new development for the hominid family. Now, experts have suggested, and I don't know how well, not being in this field as my area of expertise, I don't know how well this has been flushed out in terms of dietary science, but much of what I've read has suggested a strong link between cooked protein, in other words, cooked meat, and brain development. And so rapid brain development kind of grows in line with how much cooked meat and cooked protein people eat. So harnessing fire is great. This not only provides defense for the group, they're going to set up fires for warmth. They're going to set up fires to force animals in the wilderness away as a form of defense. They're going to use fire also to cook. And this might be contributing to the growth of hominid brains, this development of harnessing and using fire. Now, there has also been recent evidence that vocal cord development among Homo erectus was such that they would have had the ability to form rudimentary speech. Now, there is no real evidence for them forming a language as such, but then again, we are now loosening our definition of what language is. Language doesn't have a set definition. In terms of their phenotype or how they look outwardly, Homo erectus also starts to more readily resemble modern humans in that they start to lose a lot of their body hair. They start to look more and more like hairy people and less like bald apes. And so what we're seeing here is that they start to look a little bit more like humans. Now, this group would differ from all of the other hominins that came before them in terms of the way that they dealt with childbirth and the socialization and rearing of their kids. Now, the common trend that we've been seeing is as these hominids keep moving forward towards humanity, their brains get bigger and bigger. There's a problem with that you got to think about. The bigger and bigger the brain gets, the bigger and bigger a head needs to be. The bigger and bigger a head needs to be, well, if you're a woman who's been through childbirth, you know what that means. The head eventually of these hominins would get so big that you couldn't pass it through a birth canal. And so for a kid to be born pretty well developed already, their head would have to be massive, and it literally could not pass through the pelvis of their mothers when they're going through childbirth. So there's an adaptation in Homo erectus that's going to continue onwards with the other hominids. And that adaptation is giving birth to really underdeveloped babies. And I promise you, being a father of a newborn who's just about 4.5 months old, this is true. Our babies, when I've had kittens and I've had puppies and I've had a baby now. By the time a cat is about 6 months old, they're fully developed. By the time, even if you take a higher order animal, something like a gorilla, they're fully developed. They're fully capable of sexual maturity, physical maturity. They're self-sustainable about the age of 7. Whereas when we give birth to kids, they are physically incapable of doing anything. They're mentally incapable of doing anything because their heads are small and they're going to have to develop outside of the womb. What that means is that we are not going to be passing a lot of instinctive intelligence onto our children. In fact, we are still looking for a lot of evidence of instinctual intelligence in human beings, and it's hard to come by. The fact of the matter is, our kids don't come out knowing how to teach history because I know how to teach history. And some of you by the end of the semester might say, hey, even I didn't figure it out, but we'll leave that for later. What we're talking about here is that people don't come out with knowledge already formed. Our species, we need to teach our children, and it takes a long time. My daughter, 4.5 months in, is just now coming to a point where she can physically hold her own head up. Think about it. Our kids are like this, and if you pick them up, they can't even hold their own head until they've hit a certain age. And all of this development is happening outside of the womb. That forces us to devote more time to child care and more time to child rearing. And it also develops better group attitudes. Because unlike in modern society where our attitude is my kid and you don't tell my kid what to do, that's new. Most of human history, we have raised children as communities, as groups. And you can still see this in other areas around the world. I work in Nigeria, and if somebody else's kid is acting poorly in a public setting and their parents not around, a random adult will discipline that child and say, you don't do this. And even though they're not related to them, they don't have any innate sort of connection to the kid, that is a community raises a child. And so that is a major turn for Homo erectus and something you all need to be fairly well aware of. So that brings us to what we've been driving at the entire time. And I'm at 26 minutes about here, and that's not too bad. We are at Homo sapiens, or anatomically modern human beings. Just to take away any confusion whatsoever, I'm talking about us, human beings, the ones that are sitting around taking this class here today. Around 200,000 to 150,000 years ago, modern man emerges in East Africa. The most recent development in hominid evolution proved to continue this march towards greater sophistication. We represent the most sophisticated developments of evolution within hominid development. So, anatomically modern humans are a highly social creature that developed during another episode of climactic upheaval. Our species developed complex and representative languages that would allow them to communicate better and create better group cohesion amongst our species, amongst our groups within the species, I should say. This, in turn, our ability to foster better group dynamics and cohesion allowed us to form bigger groups than earlier hominids could have. They weren't quite smart enough to be able to deal with a group of 40 to 50 people. They were stuck more at like 10 to 12. And so what that does, it gives humanity an advantage. So we had been, really, when we look, it's hard to assess what humanity really is in the overall scope. When I talked about these other hominids, they've been around for millions of years, hundreds of thousands of years. We're a relatively recent development. We're a few thousand years old, or a few 100,000 years old. And really, we're a blink of the evolutionary eye compared to some of the other creatures that have lived on this earth. Now, really, it's right around 200,000 years ago, we start to develop, and really, we're going to start to spread at a rapid pace. What we're most successful at as a species is driving out of our traditional homeland and settling in other territories. We're a highly migratory species. Today we've been on every continent on the planet, and we inhabit most of the planet. It's really just a few areas around the poles that we haven't come to develop permanent human settlements. Now, that means we're really adaptable, and that means by the process of natural selection, if you're believing the theory of evolution, we are the ones that are most successful to survive. But we barely survived we were barely adapted in terms of this climactic shift that was happening. Evidence of an ice age spread across all of Eurasia and the world at this time. Things got a lot colder, the climate changed, and this drove a lot of other hominins to extinction. But Homo sapiens almost didn't survive this. Our numbers dwindled down to just a few thousand people that remained in the African forests until the conditions in the northern part of the East African highlands and elsewhere became more favorable to us. So our ability to hide out and ride out the end of an ice age is what allowed us to persevere as a species. But what that means in very simple terms is that every human being on this planet can be traced back to a very small population of a few thousand that survived in the forests of Africa. Now, modern anatomical human beings are, as I mentioned, are highly migratory creatures, and that migration is going to be what sort of covers the rest of this class. We're going to be talking about hominid migration out of Africa, and ultimately the way that that looks to to modern humanity, and how how Homo sapiens became the most dominant migratory group. So we eventually are going to spread out of Africa and become the most prevalent migrants, reaching a lot of distant lands. However, we're not the only hominid species to leave Africa. Homo erectus migrated out of Africa roughly 1.8 million years ago. They first passed through the Horn of Africa. They went to the Levant region, and then they moved into the rest of Eurasia. Most of the time, they're following coastlines and rivers. But while in Asia and Europe, these groups continued to move and settle. But when that climate shift happens, they weren't that well adapted because Europe and Asia, during that period, they're going to start to get covered in cold and ice, and these groups really couldn't deal with it, and so they start to die out. So some of them remained in sort of when later Homo sapien migrants came. Some of these groups were still there, but many of them had died out, and so once new migrants showed up, they were just going to be outcompeted out of the landscape. So ultimately, Homo erectus would spread as far as East Asia, and there's evidence of their settlements in northern China and as far south as the island nation of Java. So conventional wisdom suggests that Homo erectus was outcompeted by other later hominid arrivals, and they were either driven to extinction by increased competition, or they might have also been absorbed into the human genome. Something that we're going to address a little bit later in this lecture is crossbreeding between these hominids. So ultimately, the Homo erectus left, and then the next group to really widely leave Africa is something called Homo heidelbergensis, which is really sort of a precursor to two other more important proto-humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans. Now, as a side note here, I break them out as two different names because that's how I learned about them back in school. More recently, they started saying they're all the same group. They just live in two different regions. Denisovans are in Asia, Neanderthals are in Europe. And so a lot of people call them Neandersovans. But for intents and purposes, I'm going to keep them separated out because I'm old and I'm resistant to change. 700,000 to 200,000 years ago, Homo heidelbergensis developed in eastern and southern Africa before spreading north to North Africa and then eventually into Europe. To be really honest, I'm not going to say a lot about this group because even experts in their field don't really know a whole lot about them. They're considered to be contemporaries of Homo erectus and probably an offshoot group of Homo erectus that moved in a different direction. Whereas Homo erectus was moving more towards Asia, they're moving more east, heidelbergensis continued going directly north. So, despite the uncertainty and debate that remains surrounding heidelbergensis, it's widely accepted that from heidelbergensis, other hominid groups developed, and that is Neanderthals and Denisovans. The most reliable evidence suggests that heidelbergensis basically they were in Europe and in North Africa when Neanderthals started coming that way, and they were absorbed into the Neanderthal group, that they were basically so close that the Neanderthals just absorbed those old remnant populations there, and they became part of the Neanderthal gene. So Neanderthals are another hominin group that left Africa. They did so about 150,000 years ago, and they settled mostly in modern-day Europe. Now, compared to human beings, they're shorter, they're stockier, and they're quite a bit stronger than their Homo sapien cousins. But what they don't have is dexterity and cognitive ability. For what we can tell, the Neanderthal had a very tenuous grasp on symbolic and abstract thinking. They didn't have the same capability as Homo sapiens have to think that way. So for many years, the idea was that Europeans developed out of Neanderthals. Not everybody believes in the single human family moving out of Africa theory. That is the most accepted theory. It's the one that we're going to follow in this class. But others believe that different subgroups, different proto-humans around the planet, divergently evolved into the different races that we see today. That's not a well accepted, and science doesn't flesh that out. Neanderthals actually are contributors to human DNA, and it's something we're going to be talking about in a minute. And so, really, what we're thinking is that for a very long time, it was thought that Neanderthals were Europeans, that Europeans just evolved out of Neanderthals and into European man. But that's not the case. Europeans, like the rest of the human race, are Homo sapiens, who came up and interacted with Neanderthals in Europe. So they lack this ability to think outside the box. They lack dexterity as well. They're not fine tool users and makers. They are tool users. They make stone tools, they make spears, they make bows and arrows, but the technicality, the complexity, they don't have the fine motor skills that modern humans do. And so the same can be said for Denisovans. They're shorter, they're stockier, they're basically Neanderthals, but they live in Asia. They left Africa just before the Neanderthals did, and they left a lot of remnants of stone-using culture in Asia. They populated that area quite a while back. Usually it's dated to the lower Paleolithic period. But like the Neanderthals, this group would have slowly succumbed to pressure from their migrating cousins, the Homo sapiens. So, ultimately, what we're looking at is one thing I wanted to sort of bring out here is Neanderthals and Denisovans in our modern day gene pool. This is a recent development, and it's something that your book kind of gives it a one sentence treatment, but the more research they do into this subject, the more we're seeing evidence for a lot of interbreeding between all different types of hominins. So, up until very recently, this would have been considered a taboo subject. And really, what we need to consider here is that these groups were always treated as different species. And as most of you who, with the high school science probably remember, different species can't breed and make fertile offspring. And so, what it's telling us is that maybe our understanding of what we call a species is not really all that adequate in order to define what's happening in the natural world. Because what we are seeing is that if we look at human genomes and we look at genetic markers, we're becoming increasingly aware that there's considerable interbreeding going on between the many different proto-human groups and modern human beings. Denisovan DNA comprises between 3 to 5% of all the indigenous populations found in Oceania, so like Australia, New Zealand, Melanesia, and like Papua New Guinea. And so when you go and you look at those groups, and they generally test those groups because they're isolated and they have a distinct genetic structure that separates them out from the more mixed up areas of Asia. And so they look at those groups and they found about 3 to 5% of all of those groups have Denisovan DNA in them. What that tells us is that Denisovans had sex with modern Homo sapiens, and our family, Homo sapiens, have absorbed the Denisovans into our bloodlines. The Denisovans were effectively bred out of existence. We were more numerous. We were better suited to our environment, and we outcompeted them, and so they were fewer in numbers, and we slept with them, and they just became part of the modern human genome and the modern human gene. The same is true of Neanderthals. Almost every modern day European everybody of European descent, people who are of European descent in the Americas, are all 1 to 4% Neanderthal in their DNA. And so you can tell that there was ready interbreeding going on in that area as well. So what we're seeing is that when it comes to Africa, because you might be saying, okay, Asian groups have been mixing with Denisovans, European groups were mixing with Neanderthals. What's going on in Africa? We don't know, but we can guess. And the best educated guess we can come up with is absolutely they were interbreeding. Why would they be the only group that didn't? And plus, what we're seeing here is that we don't know. There are so many different hominin fossils being found in Africa. We don't know what to make of any of them. We don't know which one represents maybe an infertile offspring of breeding between this group and that group, or maybe which one was fertile offspring between this group and that group. We don't know what homonyms were mixing. In other words, we don't know what we're looking for even in Africa because there were so many different hominids there. And so, since we don't know what we're looking for, we can't find it in the genetic markers as readily. The only area where we do know, where the evidence we have for me to confidently sit here and say, yes, it did happen in Africa, is the Khoisan people of southern Africa. They're a pretty isolated group. When you test their DNA, we can find very clear evidence that there was breeding going on between the modern human beings and some sort of proto-human that was living there. And so what we tend to see here is that we're thinking the Khoisan people of southern Africa are showing some sort of proto-human DNA mixed up in them, but we're not 100% certain which one it is. The strong consensus seems to be that it's Heidelbergensis at this point. But ultimately, I just want a quick note on gender as it relates to this process of interbreeding between these different proto-humans and Homo sapiens. Almost universally, we're seeing proto-humans females having sex with Homo sapien males. And what we're tending to sort of ascribe to that is that we think in the most recent research, and it is controversial, but I like to present a bit of controversy and let you all hash it out. I'm not saying it's fact, it's just the newest theory. The newest theory is that more likely than not, the more developed and the more complex Homo sapien group more or less kidnapped sex slaves and concubines from proto-humans. So when a Neanderthal group came into conflict with Homo sapiens killed the men and the children and had sex with the women. They took them as sex slaves, basically. So we're seeing instances of sexual assault and sexual violence as early as we are even a set species. And so that's something that's very prevalent in at least what we think in the early sort of structure of human society and their interactions with these other groups. So that wraps up the more technical end of stuff where we're talking about the development of modern humans, their spread outside of Africa. Modern humans are leaving Africa and they're going out into Eurasia. And so really, when we look time-wise, we're thinking Homo sapiens are going to leave Africa about 100 to 60,000 years ago. They arrive in Asia 60,000 years ago. They start to populate Europe between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago. And then we're going to deal with the spread of humans to Australia and the Americas a little bit later because it happens at a later date. So another thing I wanted to bring up here is how these new humans are living. So we developed evolutionarily a little bit better than our proto-human counterparts. But we're still going to be living in the same basic social structure. We relied on hunting and gathering as a means of subsistence, of survival. We hunted large game animals in large groups. And we collected wild berries, grains, nuts, and cereal crops. And almost immediately, we start to see a gender division of labor happening in human society. Women would be tasked more with the gathering and the collection of berries and nuts, whereas men were given the task of going out and hunting large game animals in groups. And so there is, obviously, women carry the reproductive capabilities of any society. Those are highly valued in these early societies. Women are kind of put on a pedestal. And the general thought amongst social scientists is the need to protect the reproductive capability is why women weren't sent out to do more dangerous tasks like hunting and going out and bringing down game animals. So ultimately, these early hunters and gatherers lived in tribes and clans, and they were mostly made up of extended families. The numbers of these early societies were relatively small compared to what we're going to see in later history. They're living in small groups, maybe 40, 50 people. But in addition to just surviving, these groups had an ability to conceive, as I mentioned, of abstract or theoretical concepts. And this is what sets Homo sapiens apart from the rest of the other hominids. We do this far more effectively, and we do it far more often than they do. And what this gives rise to is pretty much everything we define as human. Religion, art, music, cosmologies, our different worldviews. And chiefly among all of these developments, the thing most important for human survival, communication and set language, true language. Now, human beings for a long time are considered the only species that uses language. But really, what we're going to see is that other animals do have forms of communication that could be called language. That, again, is a poorly defined term. What is language? When a dog barks, is it language? Well, if another dog understands him, yeah, maybe it is. And so we have a bit of lack of clarity as to what we mean by language within the historical literature. But all of these things are generally, when we see human beings, when we look at their artwork and what they're producing, they're generally reflecting on what it is that they do back in this time period. Whenever they're drawing a piece of artwork, it's generally a scene of a hunting scene, something that a game animal that they're following. They're all natural things. When we look at their development of religions, they're generally animistic and pantheistic, tied to the earth itself, very environmentally based. In other words, if I'm relying on grains and berries to grow to feed myself, I'm going to pray for fertility for the earth. I want them to grow well. If I'm going to want to be successful in a hunt, I'm going to pray to a specific deity that helps me do that. They see religion and they see spirituality in the world around them, and that's called animism. So they're gonna have different functions for all these different sorts of species, but it suffices to say that they're very largely reactive to the environment around them. The construction of set language, though, is really important because this allows large numbers of people to communicate, and it is a critical departure from the more crude forms of communication that we see in proto-humans, and then also within the the Neanderthals and things like that come immediately before Homo sapiens. So, in order to work together and strive and survive, they needed more highly sophisticated forms of communication. It's not enough to go, and that means snake. It's now we're going to come up with a specific word for snake. I don't want it. We need clear, concise communication. And that's where language develops. And this gives birth to the diversity of language families that we still see all over the world. Indo-European, you have Vedic languages, you have Uralic and Turkic and all these other Bantu, these other you have sort of the Nilo-Saharan. You have all these different language families. And really what's important about language is not just the ability to communicate, but it also means something about group inclusion. If you don't speak my language and you can't communicate with me, you're not part of my group. I don't care about you. You're not part of the cohesion. You're something else. You're different, and I don't need to worry about you. I'm concerned with the well-being of my group, the people who speak my language, the people who communicate with me. The language forms the basis for group inclusion, and that is a critical development. If you don't speak the language, you're not included in the group, therefore you are not a part of this society. So that is a brief aside on language and the development of that. Now we get to the topic of populating the Americas. And the reason that I put this one off until after we talked about hunter and gatherer societies, because the populating of the Americas is related to hunting and gathering, namely hunting. Around 30,000 years ago, human beings are already living in the Siberian region of Asia. It's an area that we collectively refer to historically as Beringia. They were living in bands of hunter-gatherer groups, and because of that, these people were following large game animals, woolly mammoths, buffalo, things like that, deer. When the earth starts to change and the sea levels start lowering because the ice caps are forming again, the sea waters sink. And the theory is that animals started opening, the new path opened up that connected Northeast Asia with Alaska. And as that opened up, the animals started following that path. Right behind the animals, the human beings were following them. And the theory goes that they crossed the Bering Land Bridge that would have connected Northeast Asia with Alaska, eventually populating the Americas and becoming the progenitors of Native American cultures. Well, people tend to imagine this as, hey, a land bridge opened up, let's go, and now all of a sudden they're in the Americas. You got to understand this is happening over thousands of years. People are going to live and die on that land bridge. Some people actually go and turn back. They live on the land bridge for a few generations, and then their community moves back with the animals towards Asia. Some other animals keep moving on, and human beings follow them into the Americas. It's a more simplistic process. They're just following animals. Now, the Bering Land Bridge theory has been in existence for a very long time. It's very widely accepted. But there has been new evidence coming out, seems like hand over fist recently, that is positing a different theory for how people came to the Americas. The new theory is saying that they followed the coastlines and partially sailed here to the Americas. That they were still following game animals, but they're not following this land bridge per se. They're basically going to sail around the coastlines where they need to, and when they can walk, they get out of their boat's portage and they walk. But that is the theories that explain how people came from Asia to the Americas. The last group that we need, or area that we need to identify being populated, is Australia. Human beings probably arrived there as early as 45,000 years ago. We have found fossil evidence for that. Human migration pattern followed the coasts down the Indian Ocean after they left Africa. So they're going to basically go through the Arabian Peninsula and then follow the Indian Ocean coast down. Once they arrived in modern-day Indonesia, they followed the coasts of the islands all the way south down to Australia. This is another area where there's a considerable degree of debate and discord. People are not 100% certain how this process played out. There's some people who are saying that the migrants of 45,000 years ago were skilled boat builders and were able to navigate around these islands. There are other people coming out saying no, that the technology just wasn't there. But really, what we think might have happened is there were land bridges opened up between Australia and Southeast Asia at that point in time that we're unaware of. Now, the first wave of migrants came in about 45,000 years ago, and there was a trickle of people into Australia after that. But the end of this migratory pattern comes about 4,200 years ago, when we're going to see a second wave of migrants who we do know arrived by boat. They are going to be diversifying the gene pool and forming the gene pool of native Australian cultures. So, we're pretty much done with the movements of people around the planet. Now, there is the Bantu migration to still deal with. We'll get to that in a second. But I do want to talk about agriculture. And I know this is a lot to chew on here in the early part of the semester, but these are big, big shifts in human lifestyles that we need to address. With agriculture, it was a totally different beast in terms of food production. As far as we can tell, agriculture occurs from a shift in the Neolithic period, something we call the Neolithic Revolution. This is a turn towards agriculture, and human beings are being motivated to do this by two factors. One, they start to become more and more familiar with cultivatable crops. And two, the global climate starts to warm around this period, making agriculture far more feasible. Now, this is a critical development for human society because it pushes a few different processes into play. Number one, if we're going to go and invest a lot of money into farming and setting up farms, well, then in that case, we're going to set up a community and stay. You're no longer nomadic if you're a farmer. You put your farm in the ground, you're stuck. And so this is where we start to form towns, villages, settlements, large groups of people living in one area. And then another thing this does is it produces a food, it makes us less nomadic, and then it helps us produce a food surplus. We're no longer just collecting what we need to get through day by day to eat. We're creating more food than the society needs. Now you might think, what's the big deal? The big deal is that that allows for specialization and sophistication to occur within the society. Look, if I've got to go out every single day and make sure that my family is fed, I got enough food for me, my wife, and my kid, I don't have time to think about history. I don't have time to wax about poetry. I don't have time to sit there and think about what the best way to build a weapon is. All I need to do is get out and get food. If there's a surplus and I don't have to produce my own food, now I can specialize in something else. I can become a politician, a blacksmith, a woodworker, a warrior. I can do any number of things because I don't have to worry about producing my own food. This greatly increases the level of sophistication in human societies. And so when it comes to agriculture, it starts to spread first in Asia. That's where we tend to see agriculture and animal husbandry. Um, it's mostly cereal crop production in the early years, but it's taking place in Asia around 12,500 years ago. From there, it's slowly the tactics and techniques of agriculture slowly start to shift over towards Europe. And so Europe is going to adopt their agricultural tactics from Asia. The process towards developing usable agriculture in the Americas happens a little bit later. It starts 9,000 years ago, but true settled agriculture emerges in the Valley of Mexico right around 5,000 years ago. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's going to happen even later. So settled agriculture is thought to have emerged in sub-Saharan Africa alongside the Bantu migration. Here we see a bunch of iron tool using Bantu agriculturalists spreading farming techniques. They leave West Africa near the modern day border of Nigeria and Cameroon before they spread first into Central Africa and then they hang out for a bit. Then there's a secondary migration where they spread from Central Africa to Eastern and Southern Africa. The process starts about 3,000 years ago, but it moved really slowly, and the Bantu migration is considered to have ended in Southern Africa right around 300 Common Era. So that's what spread farming techniques over to Africa. So, lifestyle in an agricultural settlement is quite a bit different than what you would have found in a hunter-gatherer group. First, the locations of the farms, it meant that people could no longer be nomadic. The hunter-gatherers are still going to remain highly nomadic because they have to follow their prey around large areas. So we have more and more need for rule and organization and leadership. These are quickly going to start to emerge within these societies. Hunter-gatherer societies tend to be more egalitarian. You can see it even in their spatial setup. They tend to go in circles. They build in circles, kind of like everyone's just floating around. We're all within the circle. And so there's a less rigid structure to this. They rely more on gerontocracies, where old and wise people make decisions. They rely more on group decision-making processes. In a city with a lot of people, you need one person pulling the trigger, saying, look, if I have everybody debate everything all the time and look at our city. If we had 7 million people all have to get their say, nothing will ever get done. So we elect leaders. And that's a major shift that's going to start to happen. And they start building more in rectangular so that we can delineate cleanly. That's my property. This is your property. That's mine. This is yours. And now we have rules delineating the boundary. My farmland from your farmland. These don't exist in hunter-gatherer societies. And so these are major shifts that start to happen in these agricultural settlements. All right, so in this lecture, we have successfully, I'm going to pat myself on the back here, I hope you got it, nearly 60 million years of this planet's history, and in particular the history of hominins and humans. And we touched on the development of hominins towards human beings. Now, modern humans are the culmination, what you really got to take away from this, of a long evolutionary shift from simple social interactions towards far more complex social interactions. And the whole time this is happening, our brains are getting bigger, and because our brains are getting bigger, we're becoming more capable of social complex interaction, and the whole chicken and the egg just keeps going around and around, ultimately leading to our modern societies. So, now, the result of humanity's emergence around the globe is the widespread peopling of every area of the globe. You could see how quickly we came out. With every other group, we were talking about millions and hundreds of thousands of years of evolution and die-in and die-out and all this other stuff. With human beings, they left Africa 60,000 years ago. By 300 BC, they are ultimately spreading agriculture over every part of the world. You can see how rapid this process really is when you look at it in evolutionary terms. With the movement of humans towards culture and society, we see that hominins are not so easily parceled out and isolated from one another. like I said, the interbreeding, with our uncertainty as to which groups were living in communications with others, we are not just the result of a single lineage of species moving in one direction. We're really more amalgams of everything that had been happening amongst the hominins as a family towards this end of developing human beings as a species. And then with the shift away from hunter-gatherer societies, and this witness that we've seen from hunter-gatherer to settlement and towns and villages and agriculture, we will be ready when we get to our next lecture next week to deal with the shift towards and the origins of true human civilizations, something we'll be looking at next week. So that wraps it up for me. I hope you're all doing well. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. And if you really need to talk, we can set up a Zoom appointment anytime. Take care.